Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Happy July 4th, and today is also the British election, and I think by the time you guys are watching this video, the exit polls will be out. But today what we're covering is in regards to the Pokrovsk Direction for the most part, because we really do have continued changes over here day over day. And while in some parts of the front line, we don't see these daily changes, just over the past week, consistently, we've seen the Russians continue to push on, specifically through two axes in the Vovcha River area. And now they're very close to actually reaching that river physically. So that's important. We're also going to talk about the Toretsk situation. And finally, we'll finish off by looking at Russian DRG operations that have recently escalated on the Sumy Kharkiv border. But first, as I said, we're going to look at the situation. What I'll say is around novomykhailiva first, but then we'll go further north to the rail line. And so all we have now is additional information verified first by the Ukrainian sources, but it's also being reported by the Russians alike. Not really in dispute, but we'll have to wait for videos to show the full extent of the engagements. But the Russian forces were able to capture this slot of fields that really amounts to around 5 square kilometers of land taken over by the Russians. And it is a culmination of the Russian pressure that's been exerted through Eastern Osokil, through Western Osokil, that has then made it impossible for the Ukrainians to hold on to their forward positions in this highlighted region in blue. And this is an important region because it's on a hill, which essentially overlooks Voskod nearby, avdiivka, and then directly overlooks Novomykhailiva Parisha to the south. And so now all of the forward positions in the region that have any sort of height advantage are under Russian control. And then you also have Russian pressure on the Ukrainian village, not just from the east, from Pokrovsk, from a population center, but also directly from this paved road and near this fortified structure just from the north. And so now this specific fortified center is turning into a gray zone. It can't be really marked as reliably Ukrainian anymore as the Russians are moving closer and closer. And really, this is the final village the Ukrainians have and under full control east of the Vovcha River, which is a big issue now as their positions here are getting more and more exposed as really the noose tightens on any sort of bridgehead they have in this region. And I won't repeat what I said in my last video regarding this part of the front line, but just very quickly, there are two important crossings that are in western Novomykhailiva Parisha through the Vovcha River that the Russian forces really would be able to take advantage of in the case where the Russian forces would be able to take over the village swiftly. You have this one over here, and then you have this one going further to the southwest to Mezhove, reaching some of Ukraine's nearby fortified structures. And so now the Russian forces have advanced, just to recap, about 1.7 kilometers southwards. And in the process, they've been able to fully capture Voskod, which is just an extension of Sokil. And so it's not too momentous, but of course it shows that the Russian forces have been able to overrun the Ukrainian defenders that really try to push them back along these two basically parallel roads. And it is a very narrow area of confrontation, which should be an advantage for the Ukrainians, which is why they even were able to maintain the front line here for nearly a month, give or take, in a similar region in a span of a couple of kilometers. But eventually, it has broken down. That is just inevitable. It's a numbers game in regards to the attrition rates for the Ukrainians and the fact that the Russians do have the wherewithal with the units that are currently composed over here, whether it be from the 27th Division or any other DPR force, for instance, or newly formed territorial units or assault brigades, all of them being involved in these assaults. They have the ability to continue with them, whether it be on foot or through vehicles. And now we're seeing them also push into villages like avdiivka, which is now considered partially a gray zone. And that puts into question for how long the Ukrainians can even maintain control over these final two fortified strongholds that they have east of the Vovcha River. Losing them would essentially open the pathway along this particular tributary to reaching the river in an area that also is relatively narrow, also pretty shallow, and then expose any sort of Ukrainian positions westwards on the west bank ridge of the Vovcha River, which is where the Ukrainians have really been banking, no pun intended, on building a more unified, cohesive defense line that could be used in the mid-term. And that is something that the Russian forces are definitely looking at undermining. And that's also why they haven't stopped putting the pressure here. They're not letting go of the momentum. They're just continuing both around Voskod, but then also further north. We're just see continued pushes towards the positions of the 47th Brigade, 116th Brigade, and 110th Brigade. Generally, the units defending here along the rail line, specifically along the paved road that we always talk about, which has been so important for the Russian forces and the nearby windbreaks. And so this time they were able to advance not 1 kilometer, I think it was like 750 kilometers if we're measuring it out in its full extent. Yeah, this region over here, they were essentially able to take just north of Avdiivka, further adding to the pressure that the Ukrainians have by getting more control over the hills north of Sokil, overlooking any sort of Ukrainian defense, whether it be in Pokrovsk, as now a lot of Ukrainian units have consolidated and retreated to this area in particular. They are at least partially protected by this forested region, but we see now the Russian forces have been able to quickly push through smaller tree lines in regions around here, like this one over here, this one over here, and there was relatively little Ukrainian resistance, but they're going to try to drag it out in an area like Pokrovsk because of how it acts as a linchpin going further westwards, and it also connects to the hamlet Vovcha. So again, it's basically a 1.5 square kilometer gain here through that field. And it's not just relegated to the area south of the rail line. In part, we've also seen advances north of the rail line towards the village Luzhvatske, which really is difficult to call a village because there aren't many structures around here. It is basically a hamlet, but it is sort of protruding from a larger line of Ukrainian villages that I talked about in my last video that run along the Toretsk River over here. So I won't expound upon it in too much detail, but then you have this tributary that's sort of bouncing off over here, and it's more exposed to Russian attacks. I said that yesterday, and really on point, basically, the Russian forces have opened up a new attack vector along here, and it just makes sense because they have control over these fields that are on a hill south of novomykhailiva, directly overlooking any sort of Ukrainian holdings here, which would be minimal if they still do exist. But nonetheless, there is a Ukrainian effort to repel them, which does make sense because you don't want to have a forward operating base here, because then the Russian forces will have control over this road going southwards towards Pokrovsk, for instance, or directly towards Timofivka to the north. So you do want to prevent that really at all costs right now. And so then you have this video over here from July 4th, a new video, Russian vehicle. I think it was actually 2 Russian vehicles that were filmed in this drone footage, and they were destroyed by Ukrainian FPV drones. That's what was claimed. And this was on a specific path towards Luzhvatske, whether it be from a western advance or an advance from novomykhailiva directly to the southwest. I don't actually know, but it was posted by Ukrainian channels and by their drone crews, showing how, in addition to the 2 destroyed, you also had 3 that were abandoned along the same path, but I don't see any damage there. And then you see 3 Russian soldiers dragging the body of another Russian soldier along a similar path near one of these tree lines. And so it gives an idea of the fact that the Ukrainians are not like totally inept here. They're definitely able to spot Russian advancing forces even in smaller numbers and target them. And that's also why it's slowed down over the really post-Avdiivka period in certain points, whether it be at the Durna River or previously around Sokil in early June, or in any other sort of engagement after Avdiivka. There's always been a certain level of Ukrainian resistance, which of course feeds into their stockpiles, but we could see how that reduces the extent of the Russian advances over time. But it's definitely not enough to do it in a long-term setting here, especially in an area like Luzhvatske, which is just totally exposed. And so now that video does confirm to us that the Russian forces were able to advance from the nearby trenches about 1 kilometer to the west. Now, moving on to the Toretsk front, I just want to start by saying that you can see there are now more fortifications overlaid on the map, which is going to be very useful because I don't want people to think that in certain regions there are gaps. There actually aren't, at least in terms of the fortified works. And so a really special thanks to this account, Playfro, which was involved in just single-handedly adding in all of these yellow markers. So this is not my own work. I just exported a KML file of this, but it really is insane work that they did. So credit to them, of course. I would never have the time on my hands to individually go through the satellite imagery that's publicly available and then plot on every single line where you see a sort of depression. And that's essentially what happened here, and it just shows you how intricate on paper these defenses are. And then seeing again how in an area north of Sumy, where you do see there are defenses, the Russians were simply able to overturn them in a matter of less than a week. It really does speak to the manpower shortages they have over here. And the fact that even 2 weeks into this debacle, the Ukrainians have still not been able to muster a sufficient force to at least temporarily stop the advances, only making them worse, is also a sign of a really big issue, especially when we're talking about such an important part of the front line like Pivnishnya and Toretsk and New York. We're not talking about an area that is isolated from the broader front line. This is actually a key part of Ukraine's entire plan of holding onto the Donbass because of how the Toretsk area protrudes deeper towards an area like Horlivka and sort of acts as a large salient and a large buffer with a lot of fortified structures to prevent the Russians from then pushing deeper into what I would say is central Donbass in this case. And also it has access essentially to a lot of roads through Toretsk. And so seeing a faltering of the lines in an area like this, in an area that on paper you would least expect, it is concerning. And so that's why they moved in the 28th Brigade from Bakhmut, which is just due to proximity. They needed a unit to quickly come in. But I haven't seen any other units mentioned besides something a deep state mentioned, which I have to take note of. And that is I think it is the 241st Kievska Territorial Defense Brigade. At the very least, their Territorial Defense Battalion is also around here. And so I was previously under the impression that that brigade was operating around Bakhmut. Maybe I was just wrong, or maybe it was also moved in due to its proximity to hold the line around here. And again, moving it from Bakhmut, I get why, because you need just desperate changes. But then again, Bakhmut's probably really one of the worst areas to move forces from right now, or I should say chasiv after all the developments with the capture of the Canal district by the Russians. Moving forces away is just something that will embolden the Russians to continue pushing, maybe not across the canal, but also in areas north of Kalina, for instance, where you just had the 24th Brigade moved in. And I noted actually how the 24th Brigade was moved from its positions around Toretsk to Bakhmut just before the Russians opened up the Toretsk front line, just a couple of days in between the two events occurring. And so there was definitely a thinking involved in what the Russians were doing of just playing this sort of game of allowing the Ukrainians to move forces to a key part of the front line and then immediately targeting the area that they left. And in turn, they have to move forces from that same part of the front line back to defend in the original spots, which is what we see over here. And so it sort of went full circle. And so now you also have the inclusion of at least one more territorial defense battalion, which is important, but it's definitely not sufficient at the current point. And soldiers from this unit are actually complaining about the frontline situation, about how it's not stabilized, how the Russians just have a continued momentum. And so it's just general negative sentiments. I just haven't seen anything specific enough from Ukrainian sources because when you're looking at the major sources that are reporting on it, they're all talking in the sense that it's ambiguous and that the situation is rapidly changing. When they say that, it means that the Russian forces were able to advance through the urban area at a pace that they were not able to expect, and that sometimes perhaps you have a very quick, organized, or not organized, but just a quick attack that the Ukrainians sent in to try to hold the line for as long as possible, and that could be what they referred to when they were talking about certain ambiguities. And so Deep State, they're really trying to claim that the video that I talked about yesterday, showing the aerial bombs being dropped onto an area near the apartment building, it was actually a mistake by the Ukrainian command, and that it was actually the Russian forces dropping the missiles onto the Ukrainians. Yeah, but even in that specific narrative that they're trying to push, which I don't know, it's possible. Like I can't prove it either way, but it just does sound like a certain means of damage control. But on the other hand, they're also admitting that the Russian forces were able, regardless of the video that we talked about, to gain a foothold in the southernmost apartment of the same complex. And they've not adjusted their map to show that the Russians have been pushed out. And so at the very least, the Russian forces do have this foothold here, now admitted by the Ukrainian side. And that is a big issue for the Ukrainians, as we talked about in yesterday's video. So I won't fully rehash it, but if the Ukrainians are unable to maintain control over here, then the second best option is to just destroy the apartments here, sort of neuter this sort of main operating node that the Russians have to overlook some of the nearby residential areas in Pivnishnya to the north or to the south west, which is already a part of Zaluzhny. And then I guess the silver lining for the Ukrainians is that even though in the process they would lose a large amount of territory that was previously used as a buffer to protect eastern flank of Toretsk, at the very least, they'd have this one final backup line before reaching the city that connects together these two very important slag heaps. Something important to note is that while we looked at areas like Vovchansk, where a big narrative is that the Russian forces opened it up in order to at least partially divert Ukrainian forces in addition to their own specific goals, operational goals in that sector, which definitely are true, but then also diverting forces was important and definitely did play a tangible role as we see manifesting even to this day. In the Vovchansk area, the Russians did move in several air assault units and other units from areas like novomykhailiva, bakhkmut even, to help with maintaining their urban warfare activities after the Ukrainians moved in just a really large amount of battalions and brigades to that region. When we're looking at an area like Toretsk and Sumy, for instance, we haven't seen the Russians redirect any sort of large amount of forces. They're operating on a limited amount of manpower, and nonetheless, they're still able to create a certain amount of fear for the Ukrainian side here and exploit pretty deep into an urban area. And so we talked about this in the last video, but it's just one brigade DPR units that was from that northern Avdiivka area. So it is a rather close move to the northeast. And then you just have elements of this PMC, the veterans PMC that are operating around here, some of whom are former Wagner elements. And the last thing that actually did change that we know of is the fact that now we have the admittal by the Ukrainian side that the Russian forces are largely in control of this really open area filled with fields just in between the rail line and the canal, which is previously marked as a gray zone. It's an area with several trenches that are basically aligned with the tree lines. And so now it's being admitted basically by the Ukrainian side that this area that I guess I could measure for you guys very quickly is under Russian control. It amounts to something like 1.4 square kilometers, and this comes after the Russian push along the rail line into northeastern Druzhba, which was confirmed yesterday. I talked about it in my video. And now you have the Russian forces just continuing to get control over these fields, which means the Ukrainians do not any longer have control over any sort of embankment near the canal and any sort of forthcoming trenches in that region. And it also means that any sort of trenches that they do still maintain control over on the western bank of the canal are really exposed, both from the east, but also due to the Russian push that has occurred over the past day or so near Druzhba and near what I think is the Bakhmutovka River over here. And lastly, looking at the northern border just to the west of where you have the Lipsy Axis, it's not that far away. It's actually pretty close to where the Russians did actually control in the initial year of the war before they were they withdrew and were pushed back under Ukrainian pressure from parts of northern Kharkiv, because you had Russian control over the village of Udi at a certain period in time. And so this is relatively connected to the general Belgorod theater, and that's why I think the Russians are able to do this. They're able to sustain these operations with DRGs because they're not attacking in an area that is awfully far away from the main logistics centers like Belgorod or near Tomarovka, where you have roads that then get close to the border and then sort of split off. And so that's been generally the nexus of where we've seen the Russian DRG attacks previously, and it's where we're seeing them now. And so you have this something that's coming from Ukrainian sources, the claim that the Russian forces have essentially captured Sotnitsky Kozachok, and what's being claimed is that it was just basically a playground for Russian DRG operators, and it's just effectively come under their control after operating it for so long and seeing that there's no Ukrainian presence there anymore. And so it's just being marked as under Russian control. In terms of DRG operations in the Sumy region, we could say they started really ticking up at the beginning of the year. Then after the Belgorod raids by the Ukrainians in March of 2024, they also picked up pace even more than that. And then in May, when you had a lot of the escalations in Vovchansk, then you saw another notch being ramped up. And now, since then, we've seen three major incidents along the border in Sumy. We saw, for instance, the Rizhivka incident, where you had the Chechens filming there and raising the flag near the city council. You had just very recently, I think I made a video about this like 2 days ago, the reports of just general Russian DRG activity. You had the video out of Zhirovka very recently this week, and also reports of DRG activity in Vasilivka. And these are not spontaneous events. They're just something that's manifested over months of Russian forces operating here, and it just picked up the pace. And now the Ukrainians that are defending here, which they're defending pretty sparsely, but whatever forces there are here, they're beginning to acknowledge that there has been this tangible impact where they can't enter certain areas anymore, or when they reach a certain point near the border, they begin getting fired upon. And that's how you know that there's just been a general shift along the border. But it's not anything too major, even now with the information about this sort of capture, essentially, of the village over here. It's not anything momentous because we don't have enough information about large amounts of vehicles being moved to the region here. It's something that we'd have to see in information about also units that are operating in this region. Because when we look at the Russian operational groupings over here, I have them really marked out in detail in the Lipsy and Vovchansk sectors. And then we don't really have any sort of concrete information surrounding large forces that are operating to the west. Perhaps you have the 245th Motorized Rifle Brigade, or regiment actually, and they were previously reported to be operating in the Belgrade region around March, and they didn't have much involvement in the Vovchansk operations, so maybe they're free to conduct these sort of roaming operations further westwards on a smaller scale. That's possible. And then you also, of course, have Akhmat that's operating here generally, and they're involved in some DRG operations. And I suppose there are some independent detachments that are very, very specialized in DRG operations and fighting in force, for instance, and doing stuff like that are also here. But this is just a small concentration, and the fact that I'm even referring to it as DRG implies that it's not anything in terms of a larger advance. But we have to wait and see, really, because let's just look very quickly at the Ukrainian side defending here, because it's not like they have any sort of beefed up connection here as well. And that's part of the problem for the Ukrainians, because the Russian forces have the freedom now to begin pinching in different parts of the front line and areas that could, from the Ukrainian perspective, be plausible for a broader Russian expansion. And then out of fear, they have to move in additional forces to sort of patch up any gaping holes. And then that leaves them exposed in another part of the front line. And this all comes down to the Ukrainians not having a readily available reserve pool to go from. And we're going to talk about this a lot in detail in future videos regarding the numbers on manpower. But even regardless of manpower, you have to, of course, organize those men and then train them and then put them into a certain brigade or grouping, and then they can be moved to a part of the front line. And so when you look at those sort of available units, you have very, very little that could be moved in. And if they could, then they would be of a lower caliber, of course. And so then you're forced to move in brigades that are involved in active combat, so they're already tired, and then moving them from important parts of the front line. And then you just get this continuing cycle, and it's something that really can be avoided. And so you're seeing, just based on the front line here, you have a very small Ukrainian concentration, perhaps the 17th Tank Brigade. They're generally floating around here, but maybe they're involved in operations around Lipsy. It can't be said with 100% confirmation. You have these very small detachments that are part of the Ukrainian GUR, for instance, the main intelligence directorates. You have these, again, small drone units that are also here trying to strike the DRG units, and so they're working in tandem with the National Guard and the GUR in that regard. And so it is also a small degree of concentration. And just a final thing regarding the elevation here, the entire border region here that I'm going to mark with these red lines is essentially on a really low-lying valley. And then again, you have this sort of horseshoe shape that forms, which starts on the Russian side and then sort of goes in between the villages that are located here, like Basove, and then between the fields to the north, and I'm marking it sort of in blue for you guys, and then it sort of goes up again, protrudes, and that entire region is on a ridge. And so just in terms of like a plainly on the ground sort of perspective for whatever forces are operating here in small numbers, this is how the elevation would sort of look like, where the Ukrainians do still maintain an advantage and could sort of overlook any sort of activity that's going on along the border. But the advantage is that all the foliage here is basically preserved because it's not really been destroyed by any sort of shelling. And so the Russians could use that for concealment. And so that's all that for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.